Tēnā koutou ko, Matt Raeburn, Toko Inua. Let me also just say, given the news that's coming out, if anybody feels like they should just put their mask on, like, don't worry about if the person next to you is going to think that you're weird or being risk adverse. Just put it on. It's fine. I'll probably keep mine on when I'm not speaking. But I deal in climate change and climate change scenarios, so I'm always thinking about that worst case scenario. I was at the Ministry for the Environment for about 3 years before I moved to Beca just a couple of months ago, and at EY before that as a manager of their climate change practice. And I moved to New Zealand in 2016. And since then, I've seen a big change in at least the way that people talk about climate change and climate change adaptation. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a big change in how we act on climate change adaptation. And this phrase, starting the journey, is one that we use a lot and that I hear a lot. But keep in mind that the planet's been on a climate change journey since the Industrial Revolution. So the journey has already been going for 170 years. The starting gun has gone off. The race has already started. If you're starting your journey as an organization, it's about catching up on the journey that the planet is already on. And kind of on a related note, so I worked on I had a bit of a hand on the National Adaptation Plan policy development. Was at the Ministry for the Environment. My concern, having been part of that process, is that a lot of the work that's going on in the Ministry for the Environment is still on kind of that just talk kind of level and not a lot of action. So when that consultation comes out on the National Adaptation Plan, I would really encourage everybody to submit comments on it if you feel like it's not going far enough. It's probably going to be more of a national adaptation report rather than a national adaptation plan, unfortunately. And it is unfortunate because the stakes are very, very high. So I was in Portland, Oregon before I moved to New Zealand. And the west coast of the US, like Australia, like lots of other places, is having a real problem with wildfires. And it's basically, the west coast is basically on fire for about 6 months a year and will be from now on. But I'm going to talk about the 2018 fire season, and the climate related cause for the fires that happened that year was that it was a particularly dry year in California. But the actual cause was that of this particular disaster that I'm going to talk about. It's called the Camp Fire. That's actually what it was called. Is that Pacific Gas and Electric, which is the utility in the San Francisco Bay Area, failed to make necessary safety upgrades to their transmission lines. And so this is the aftermath of the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise, California, which is really what it's called. $16 billion in damages, and 85 people lost their lives. And of course, PG&E knew about this risk. It was confirmed later. They filed for bankruptcy. They were bailed out by the state of California. They pled guilty to 84 counts of voluntary manslaughter. I'm not sure why it wasn't all 85, but nobody went to jail, even though this was an entirely preventable human-caused climate-related disaster. It's not just physical health, it's mental health. The Imperial College of London reported last month that there was a clear relationship between increased temperatures, number of suicides, evidence for severe distress from extreme weather events, eco-anxiety, even in people who aren't directly affected by climate change events. So these are the stakes. They're very high. They're already happening. We're well on the planet's journey of climate change, and that's why adaptation is very important. But you can't adapt until you know what your actual risks are from climate change. So there's multiple frameworks for talking about climate change related risk. I'm going to talk about one called the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD for short. And that's an international risk reporting standard that New Zealand is about to make mandatory for all of its banks, all of its insurers, and every company listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange, as well as some managed funds, investment type organizations, and all Crown financial institutions. So it's about 200 organizations in total are going to have to start assessing their climate change risks using this TCFD framework. It's actually already kind of indirectly in law in the Zero Carbon Act. All public sector agencies, including the Ministry of Health, DHBs, councils, all central government agencies, They can be asked by the Minister of Climate Change or the Climate Change Commission to provide information under those top 4 categories of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. Some colleagues and I, when we were working on the Zero Carbon Act, echoed those categories in drafting this one reporting requirement, which again, when I say that, I'm concerned that there's still a lot of talk, but not a lot of action. That reporting requirement, that ability to require organizations to report to the Climate Change Minister and the Climate Change Commission, that's kind of the only thing in the Zero Carbon Act that actually requires anybody to do anything besides the Climate Change Minister or the Climate Change Commission. So again, keep in perspective about how far we still need to go to actually get some real action. And this framework covers not just the physical risks of climate change, both your acute events from things like wildfires, storm events, tornadoes, floods, but also your chronic events like sea level rise. And it also covers the risks of the transition to a low emissions, more resilient economy. So the risks of failing to mitigate your emissions or not mitigating your emissions in the right way, or relying on technologies that potentially appear or don't appear. So it is a simple but very comprehensive framework for addressing climate change risks. And a key part of that climate change risk exercise under the TCFD framework is something called climate scenario analysis. And I think the good analogy for this is to think about it like an aircraft in a wind tunnel. The point is not to test a specific set of conditions that will actually happen, because you can't predict that. You're testing the outer limits of your aircraft's resilience to extreme conditions. And climate scenario analysis works in the same way. You will take your strategy, and not just a separate climate change strategy, but your organizational strategy, and test the resilience of that to different climate change scenarios, including, at a minimum, a scenario that's aligned with 2 degrees of warming, which is consistent with international agreements, international commitments under the Paris Agreement. But you can also test it with high warming scenarios where there's runaway global warming. You can test it with a scenario where there's potentially not as much of an orderly transition to our 2030 and 2050 targets, and really start to understand where the potential problems are with your strategy as climate change impacts continue to be exacerbated. But don't think that it's going to actually give you like answers, because you can't predict the future, but it will help you build capacity and an understanding of where your risks actually are. And so once you've done that scenario analysis and you've actually thought about your risks and identified them, then you can actually start to implement some risk management through either a separate climate change strategy, or ideally you adjust your strategy to consider climate change. Now, PG&E obviously knew about their risk and they failed to act. And that kind of ignorance of the risk isn't going to be really an excuse for much longer, because there are those reporting requirements under the Zero Carbon Act. That TCFD framework will be mandatory across almost all of New Zealand's financial system. So it's really important to start doing this process as soon as possible. And it really should be an annual process at a minimum. That's what the TCFD framework will require of, and the law will require of banks, insurers, and publicly listed companies in New Zealand. So in closing, there's a lot of work to be done, but it is doable. There are frameworks and tools out there that can help you. But the journey has already started. We're well on our way as a planet, and the physical impacts of climate change, we're already not even seeing, because there's a delay, the full extent of physical impacts of climate change just from the existing emissions that are currently in the atmosphere. And we'll be continuing to emit until at least 2050, because that's when we get to our net zero target. So unfortunately, these problems are only going to get worse. So please act now to identify your climate-related risks, begin adapting to them so that you can carry out your vital services to New Zealanders, because we are going to need them.